A frail-looking young man with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes was sitting on a rusty bench across from the police station. He was cradling a cup of coffee in his hands, not the cheap synthetic type slum rats like him had access to, but the real deal. This cup of plant-based coffee, usually available only to higher-ranked citizens, had cost most of his savings. But on this particular day, Sonny decided to pamper himself. After all, his life was coming to an end. Enjoying the warmth of the luxurious drink, he raised the cup and savored the aroma. Then, tentatively, he took a small sip and immediately grimaced.
Ah, so bitter.
Giving the cup of coffee an intense look, Sonny sighed and forced himself to drink some more. Bitter or not, he was determined to get his money's worth. Taste buds be damned.
I should have bought a piece of real meat instead. Who knew actual coffee is so disgusting? Well, it's going to keep me awake at least. He stared into the distance, dozing off, and then slapped himself in the face to wake up. What a ripoff. Shaking his head and cursing, Sonny finished the coffee and stood up. Rich people living in this part of the city were rushing past the small park on their way to work, staring at him with strange expressions. Looking haggard in his cheap clothes and from the lack of sleep, unhealthily thin and pale, Sonny was indeed out of his place here. Also, everyone seemed so tall. Watching them with a bit of envy, he tossed the cup into a garbage bin. I guess that's what 3 full meals a day would do to you. The cup missed the bin by a wide margin and fell on the ground. Sonny rolled his eyes in exasperation, walked over and picked it up, before carefully putting it in the trash. Then, with a slight grin, he crossed the street and entered the police station. Inside, a tired-looking officer gave him a quick glance and frowned with obvious distaste.
"Are you lost, boy?"
Sonny looked around with curiosity, noting reinforced armor plates on the walls and poorly hidden turret nests in the ceiling. The officer, too, looked scruffy and mean. At least police stations remain the same wherever you go.
Sonny looked around with curiosity, noting reinforced armor plates on the walls and poorly hidden turret nests in the ceiling. The officer, too, looked scruffy and mean. At least police stations remain the same wherever you go. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" "No. As demanded by the 3rd Special Directive, I am here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell." The officer's expression instantly changed from irritated to wary. He looked the young man over once again, this time with piercing intensity. "Are you sure you are infected? When did you start showing symptoms?" "A week ago?" The officer became visibly paler. "Oh, shit." Loudly, pressing a button on a terminal, "Attention! Code black in the lobby! I repeat, code black!" The nightmare spell first appeared in the world a few decades ago. Back then, the planet was just starting to recover from a series of devastating natural disasters and subsequent resource wars. At first, the emergence of a new disease that caused millions of people to complain about constant fatigue and sleepiness did not attract a lot of attention. But when they started to fall into an unnatural slumber, with no sign of waking up even days later, governments finally panicked. Of course, by then it was already too late. Not that an early response could have made any difference. When the infected started dying in their sleep, their dead bodies turning into monsters, no one was ready. Nightmare creatures quickly overwhelmed national militaries, plunging the world into complete chaos. No one knew what the spell was, what powers it possessed, and how to fight it. In the end, it was the awakened, those who survived the first trials of the spell and came back alive, who put a stop to its rampage. Armed with miraculous abilities earned in their nightmares, they restored peace and created a semblance of a new order. Of course,
It was only the first of the catastrophes brought on by the spell. But as far as Sonny was concerned, none of it had anything to do with him. Not until a few days ago, that is, when he first started having trouble with staying awake. For an average person, being chosen by the spell was as much of a risk as an opportunity. Kids learned survival skills and fighting techniques in school on the off chance of being infected.
Well-to-do families hired private tutors to train their children in all sorts of martial arts. Those from the awakened clans even had access to powerful legacies, wielding inherited memories and echoes in their first visit to the dream realm. The richer your family was, the better your chances of surviving and becoming an awakened were. But for Sonny, who had no family to speak of and spent most of his time scrounging for food instead of going to school, being chosen by the spell presented no opportunity at all. To him, it was basically a death sentence. A few minutes later, Sonny was yawning while several policemen were busy putting him in restraints. Soon he was fastened into a bulky chair that looked like a weird mix between a hospital bed and a torture device. The room they were in was situated in the basement of the police station, with thick armored walls and a formidable-looking vault door. Other officers were standing near the walls, with automatic rifles in their hands and grim expressions on their faces. Sonny did not particularly care about them. The only thing he could think about was how much he wanted to sleep. Finally, the vault door opened, and a gray-haired policeman walked in. He had a seasoned face and stern eyes, looking like someone who had seen a lot of terrible things in his life. After checking the restraints, the policeman glanced quickly on his wristwatch and then turned to Sonny.
What's your name?
Sonny blinked a few times, trying to concentrate, then shifted uncomfortably. Sunless. The old policeman raised an eyebrow. Sunless? That's a strange name. Sonny tried to shrug, but found himself unable to move. What's so strange about it? At least I have a name. Back in the outskirts, not everyone even gets one. It's because I was born during a solar eclipse. My mom had a poetic soul, you see. That's why he got this weird-ass name, and his little sister was called Rain. Back when she still lived with him, at least. Whether it was the result of poetic imagination or simple laziness, he did not know. The old policeman grunted. Do you want me to contact your family? Sonny simply shook his head. There's no one. Don't bother.
For a second, there was a dark look on the policeman's face. Then his expression turned serious. All right, Sunless. How long can you stay awake?
Not long.
The policeman sighed. Then we don't have time for the full procedure. Try to resist for as long as you can and listen to me very carefully, okay? How much do you know about the nightmare spell? Sonny gave him a questioning look.
As much as anyone, I guess? Who doesn't know about the spell?
Not the fancy stuff you see in dramas and hear in the propaganda broadcasts. I mean, how much do you really know? That was a hard question to answer.
Don't I just go into the dream realm, kill a few monsters to complete the first nightmare, receive magic powers, and become an awakened?
The old policeman shook his head. Listen carefully. Once you fall asleep, you will be transported inside your first nightmare. Nightmares are trials created by the spell. Once inside, you will meet monsters, sure, but you will also meet people. Remember, they are not real. They're just illusions conjured up to test you.
How do you know?
The policeman just stared at him, struggling through his daze to make a logical point.
I mean, no one understands what the spell is and how it works, right? So how do you know that they're not real?
Grimly. You might have to kill them, kid. So do yourself a favor and just think about them as illusions.
Oh.
The old policeman waited for a second, then nodded and continued. A lot of things about the first nightmare depend on luck. Generally, it shouldn't be overwhelmingly hard. The situation you're in, the tools you have at your disposal, and the creatures you have to defeat should be within the range of your abilities, at least. After all, the spell sets up trials, not executions. You're a bit disadvantaged due to, well, your circumstances. But kids from the outskirts are tough. Don't give up on yourself just yet. Sunny was getting more and more sleepy. It was becoming hard to follow the conversation. About those magic powers you mentioned? You will indeed receive them if you survive until the end of the nightmare. What those powers will be, exactly, depends on your natural affinity, as well as what you do during the trial. But some of it will be at your disposal right from the start. The voice of the old policeman sounded more and more distant. Sonny's eyelids were so heavy that he was struggling to keep his eyes open. Remember, the first thing you must do once inside the nightmare is to check your attributes and your aspect. If you get a combat-oriented aspect, something like a swordsman or an archer, things will be easier. If it's reinforced by a physical attribute, then that's even better. Combat aspects are the most common, so the probability of receiving one is high. The armored room was growing dimmer. If you're unlucky and your aspect has nothing to do with combat, don't despair. Sorcery and utility aspects are useful in their own ways. You'll just have to be smart about it. There really are no useless aspects. Well, almost. So just do anything in your power to survive. If you survive, you will be halfway to becoming an awakened. But if you die, you open a gate for a nightmare creature to appear in the real world, which means that my colleagues and I will have to deal with it. So, please, don't die, Sunless. Already half asleep, Sunny felt a bit touched by the policeman's words. Or, at least, try to not die right away. The nearest awakened won't be able to get here for a few hours, so we would really appreciate it if you don't make us fight that thing ourselves. What? With that last thought, Sunny finally slipped into a deep slumber. Everything became black. And then, in the darkness, a faintly familiar voice rang.
Aspirant, welcome to the Nightmare Spell. Prepare for your first trial.
Sunny dreamt of a mountain. Jagged and lonesome, it dwarfed other peaks of the mountain chain, cutting the night sky with its sharp edges. A radiant moon bathed its slopes in the ghostly pale light. On one of the slopes, the remnants of an old road stubbornly clung to the rocks. Here and there, weathered paved stones could be seen through the snow. To the right side of the road, a sheer cliff face rose as an impregnable wall. To the left, a silent black sea of nothingness indicated an endless fall. Strong winds crashed into the mountain over and over again, screaming in powerless rage. Suddenly, the moon fell over the horizon. The sun rose from the west, streaked across the sky, and disappeared in the east. Snowflakes jumped from the ground and returned into the embrace of clouds. Sunny realized that he was seeing the flow of time in reverse. In an instant, hundreds of years flew by. The snow retreated, bearing the old road. Cold shivers ran down Sunny's back as he noticed human bones littering the ground. A moment later, the bones were gone, and in their place, a slave caravan appeared, moving backwards down the mountain in the clamor of chains. Time slowed, stopped, and then resumed its usual pace.
Aspirant, welcome to the Nightmare Spell. Prepare for your first trial.
What the hell is this?
Step, step, another step. A dull ache was radiating through Sunny's bleeding feet as he was shivering from cold. His threadbare tunic was nearly useless against the biting wind. His wrists were the main source of agony. Badly hurt by the iron shackles, they sent a sharp pang of pain every time the freezing metal touched his broken skin.
What kind of a situation is this?
Sonny looked up and down, noticing a long chain winding up the road, with dozens and dozens of hollow-eyed people, slaves just like him, shackled to it at small intervals. Ahead of him, a man with broad shoulders and a bloodied back was walking with a measured gait. Behind him, a shifty-looking guy with quick, desperate eyes was quietly cursing under his breath in a language that Sonny did not know, but somehow still understood. From time to time, armed horsemen in ancient-style armor would pass by, giving the slaves menacing looks. However you judged it, things were really bad. Sonny was more bewildered than panicked. True, these circumstances were not like what the first nightmares were supposed to be. Usually, freshly chosen aspirants would find themselves in a scenario that presented them with a fair amount of agency. They would become members of privileged or warrior castes with plenty of access to necessary weapons to at least try to tackle any conflict. Starting out as a powerless slave, shackled and already half dead, was as far from being ideal as one could imagine. However, the spell was as much about challenge as it was about balance. As the old policeman said, it created trials, not executions. So Sonny was pretty sure that, to counter this abysmal start, it would reward him with something good. A powerful aspect, at least. Let's see. How do I do this? Remembering popular webtoons he read as a child, Sonny concentrated and thought about words like status, myself, and information. Indeed, as soon as he focused, shimmering runes appeared in the air in front of him. Once again, although he did not know this ancient alphabet, the meaning behind it was somehow clear. He quickly found the rune describing his aspect, and finally lost his composure.
What? What the actual fuck? Name, sunless. True name? Rank, aspirant. Soul core, dormant. Memories, echoes. Attributes, faded. Mark of divinity, child of shadows. Aspect, temple slave. Aspect description, slave is a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worth a mention. A temple slave is just the same, except much rarer.
Speechless, Sonny stared at the runes, trying to convince himself that he was maybe just seeing things. Surely he couldn't be that unlucky, right? No useless aspects, my ass. As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, he lost the rhythm of his steps and stumbled, pulling the chain down with his weight. Immediately, the shifty guy behind him screamed.
Whore's bastard! Watch where you're going!
Sonny hurriedly dismissed the runes, which were only visible to him, and tried to recover his balance. A moment later, he was once again walking steadily, however, not before inadvertently pulling on the chain one more time. You little shit! I'm gonna kill you! The broad-shouldered man in front of Sonny chuckled without turning his head.
Why bother? The weakling will be dead by sunrise anyway. The mountain will kill him. He pauses, breathing heavily. It'll kill you and me too, just a bit later. I really don't know what the Imperials are thinking, forcing us into this cold.
Speak for yourself, fool! I'm planning to survive. Sonny silently shook his head and concentrated on not falling again.
What a charming pair.
Suddenly, a third voice joined the conversation from somewhere further back. This one sounded gentle and intelligent. Gentle slave. This mountain pass is usually much warmer this time of year. We just had really bad luck. Also, I would advise you against harming this boy. Broad-shouldered slave.
Why is that?
Sonny turned his head slightly, listening. Haven't you seen the markings on his skin? He is not like us, who fell into slavery due to debts, crimes, or misfortune. He was born a slave. A temple slave, to be precise. Not long ago, the Imperials destroyed the last temple of the Shadow God. I suspect that this is how the boy ended up here. The broad-shouldered man cast a look back. So what? Why should we be afraid of a half-forgotten, weakling god? He couldn't even save his own temples.
warningly. The Empire is protected by the mighty war god. Of course, they're not afraid to burn down a few temples. But we here are not protected by anything or anyone. Do you really want to risk angering a god? The broad-shouldered man grunted, not willing to answer. Their conversation was stopped by a young soldier riding a beautiful white horse. Clad in a simple leather cuirass, armed with a spear and a short sword, he looked dignified and noble. To Sonny's irritation, the asshole was really pretty, too. If this was a historical drama, the soldier would definitely be a male lead. Young soldier. What is going on here? There was no particular menace in his voice, even something resembling concern. When everyone hesitated, the gentle-voiced slave answered. Gentle slave. It's nothing, sir. We are just all tired and cold, especially our young friend over there. This journey is truly too hard for someone that young. The soldier looked at Sonny with pity. What are you looking at? You're not much older than me. Of course, he didn't say anything out loud. The soldier sighed and took a flask from his belt before extending it to Sonny. Young soldier. Bear with it a little more, child. We will stop for the night soon. For now, here, drink some water. Child? Child?
Due to his thin body and small stature, both caused by malnourishment, Sonny was often mistaken for someone younger. Usually he didn't hesitate to use it to his advantage, but now, for some reason, being called a child really irked him. Still, he was really thirsty. He was just about to take the flask when a whip cracked in the air, and suddenly Sonny was in a world of pain. He stumbled, once again pulling on the chain and causing the shifty slave behind him to curse. Another soldier, this one older and angrier, stopped his horse a few steps back. The whip that sliced the back of Sonny's tunic open and drew blood belonged to him. Without even glancing at the slaves, the older soldier pierced his younger colleague with a disdainful glare. "What do you think you're doing?" The young soldier's face darkened. "I was just giving this boy some water. He'll receive water with the rest of them once we camp." But older soldier pierced him fiercely. "Shut your mouth. These slaves are not your friends. Understood? They're not even people. Treat them like people and they'll begin imagining things." The young soldier looked at Sonny, then lowered his head and put the flask back on his belt. "Don't let me catch you making friends with slaves again, newbie, or next time it will be your back tasting my whip." As if to illustrate his intention, the older soldier cracked his whip in the air and rode past them, radiating threat and anger. Sonny watched him go with well-concealed malice. "I don't know how, but I will watch you die first." Then he turned his head and glanced in the direction of the younger soldier, who was falling behind with his head still lowered. "And you, second." For a few minutes after that, Sonny was in a dark mood, but then he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench of the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtrated air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing. And here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air, like a second-generation Chable. Truly, being chosen by the spell has its benefits. If only there was no dreadful cold, his feet did not ache, and his wrists and back were in agony. The slave caravan slowly dragged itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who couldn't walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the road, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Sonny watched them fall with a bit of compassion. Poor fellows.
Rest in peace, you pitiful souls. All in all, he was in good spirits. It was a bit strange to feel good amidst this disaster of a nightmare, but thankfully, Sonny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before you even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But in the end, it only took Sonny several days to come to terms with it. After visiting his parents' makeshift resting place, well, actually, since he was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, it was just 2 lines carved into an old tree. And adding a 3rd line for himself, Sonny suddenly became relaxed and carefree. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? So becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death was not that much of a shock.
Besides, he knew that cold would not kill him, simply because he had already seen what fate was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, it was a pack of monsters that were going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, the attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days. So he still had a chance. Using the opportunity, Sonny decided to take another look at his status and summon the runes again. The last time, he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. The spell. Attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. The spell. Attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched it once, a long time ago. The spell. Attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own.
Interesting. Sonny quickly recognized the first attribute, fated, as the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate, to die miserably and vanish without a trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess this is how I managed to receive one of the super rare useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that. If fated was his innate attribute, then the other 2 came from the temple slave aspect. Mark of Divinity was more or less straightforward. It was supposed to allow passage into certain sacred places inside the dream realm and enhance several types of sorcery. Since there were no sacred places in sight, and Sonny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, it was useless too. Child of Shadows was a stranger one. He had never heard of it and had no idea what it was supposed to do, at least not until the sun hid behind the mountain and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sonny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness, as though it was still as bright as day. This ability alone was nothing to scoff at, and it was quite possible that Shadows would reward him with some other, yet unknown gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if...
Stop the caravan! Prepare to camp!
Following the head soldier's order, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth, and lighting up a large bonfire in the center of the camp, although not before tending to their horses. The heavy wagon carrying food, water, and other cargo, to which the main chain was firmly affixed, was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sonny noticed the young soldier from before watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. What a weirdo.
Soon, the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sonny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle, with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started, despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame.
Damn Imperials.
The soldiers walked among the slaves, giving them water and food. Sonny, just like everybody else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard, moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. By all the gods! They used to feed me better even in the dungeons! By all the gods! They used to feed me better even in the dungeons! And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows, too! A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were growing from the snow. Sonny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty those resilient things looked contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl towards the berries on all fours. "I would advise against eating those, friend." It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sonny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh for the first time. It was a tall man in his 40s, lean and strangely handsome, with a dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up a slave was a mystery. Yet there he was. "And your advice again? What? Why?" Smiling apologetically. "These berries are called bloodbane. They grow in the places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes." "So what?" Sighing softly. "Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be..."
Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man. Curses. Sonny did not pay them a lot of attention, because while looking around, he finally recognized the site of the camp as the place where, in his vision at the start of the nightmare, the bones of the slaves were buried under the snow. And he was willing to bet that whatever it was that killed them all was going to happen soon. As if to answer his thoughts, a thundering noise rang from above, and in the next second, something massive came crashing from the sky. Turning in the direction of the thundering noise, many slaves rose their heads, only to see rocks and heavy shards of ice raining on them from above. They instantly panicked, lurching away in a cacophony of screams. Shadows happily danced on black stones, as, entangled by the thick chain, those slaves fell to the ground and pulled others with them. Sonny was one of the few that remained upright, mostly because he was ready for something like this to happen. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything around with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded, and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air. Veteran soldier. "On your feet, fools! Get to the wall!" The veteran soldier, the one who had whipped Sonny a few hours before, was shouting angrily, trying to get the slaves to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round in shape and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death. That thing must be at least 4 meters tall. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated, hunched torso, and disproportionately long, multi-jointed hands, 2 of them, each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these ones shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish-gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head,
5 milky white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a terrible maw, crowding with razor-sharp teeth, was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sonny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like, under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of those unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view.
Well, that is just too much.
As soon as Sonny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction. But Sonny was one step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between himself and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, sliced through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sonny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above.
Damn, why are you so heavy?
Temporarily blinded, Sonny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrists and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened, and he was able to control his hands again.
See? Things could have been worse.
Putting his palms against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sonny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate this newly found freedom, as his blood suddenly turned to ice.
Because at that moment, with his palms still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he clearly felt something wriggling under the dead man's skin. You just had to think about how things could get worse, right, you idiot? Sonny flinched back. Pushing the corpse with his legs, he crawled as far away from it as he could, which was about 1.5 meters, thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence. On the opposite side of the corpse, the shifty slave was looking at it with slackened jaw and a horrified expression on his face. Sonny waved to get his attention. "What are you staring at? Move away from it!" The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell down. The chain was twisted between the three of them, pinned down under by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sonny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphose. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscles bulged and wriggled as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws. The face cracked and split, bearing open a twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied, needle-like fangs. This is not right. Sonny twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach. The chain! The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost. That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. But Sonny's conclusion that things weren't right did not come from self-pity. He just meant that this whole situation was literally not right. The spell, mysterious as it was, had its own set of rules. There were rules for what type of creatures could appear in any given nightmare, too. Nightmare creatures had their own hierarchy, from mindless beasts to monsters, followed by demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and finally, mythical titans, also known as calamities. The first nightmare was almost always populated by beasts and monsters, rarely with a demon mixed in. And Sonny had never, ever heard about anything stronger than a single devil appearing in it. However, the creature had clearly just created a lesser version of itself,
an ability that belonged exclusively to tyrants, the sovereigns of the nightmare spell, and those above them. What was this tyrant even doing in a first nightmare? How powerful was that damn fated attribute? But there was no time to ponder. Unfair or not, there was only one person now who could save Sunny. Himself. The broad-shouldered man, what was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth producing strange clicking noises. Without giving him time to fully come to his senses, Sunny cursed and jumped forward, grabbing onto the length of the slackened chain. One arm of the monster, now fully equipped with 5 jagged claws, shot forward to meet him, but Sunny sidestepped it with one calculated movement. What saved his skin this time was not quick reaction, but simple presence of mind. Sunny might not have learned any fancy combat techniques, since his childhood was spent on the streets instead of a school, but the streets too were a kind of teacher. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, quite often literally. That experience allowed him to keep a cool head on his shoulders in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, Sunny just acted. Stepping close, he threw the chain around the monster's shoulders and pulled, pinning its hands to its body. Before the creature, still slow and groggy from its transformation, could properly react, Sunny wrapped the chain around it several times, barely saving his face from being bitten off by the creature's terrifying maw. The good thing was, the monster couldn't move its hands now. The bad thing was, the length of the chain he used to immobilize it was gone, leaving almost no distance between them. "You two, pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it!" Because they were. The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him, and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move. Grabbing the chain from the opposite directions, they pulled as hard as they could, tightening its grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose. Great! The monster bulged its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes, as though slowly breaking apart. Not so great! Without wasting any more time, he threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles together. Then he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it, as far away from its maw as he could. Sunny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it was just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. "Die! Die, you—" Sweat and blood were rolling down Sunny's face as he was pulling and pulling and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bone spikes were in agony. And then, finally, Sunny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The spell. You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva.
Sunny fell to his knees, breathless. His whole body felt as though it just went through a meat grinder. Even large amounts of adrenaline could not wash away all the pain and exhaustion. And yet, he was exhilarated. The satisfaction of killing the larva was so vast that he even forgot to be disappointed about not receiving a memory, the special item tied to a dream realm inhabitant's essence, which was sometimes awarded by the spell to the triumphant awakened. A magic sword or a suit of armor would have come in handy right about now. Damn, he would even settle for a warm coat. 3 seconds. You can rest for 3 more seconds. After all, the nightmare was far from over. A few moments later, he forced himself to come back to his senses and looked around, trying to ascertain the situation. The larva was dead, which was great. However,
He was still tied to it by the damn chain. The shifty slave and the scholar, both pale as death, were busy untangling it to buy the three of them at least some freedom of movement. Further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh were lying on the ground. Many slaves were killed. A few had somehow managed to escape and were now running away. Fools. They're dooming themselves. The chain, as it turns out, was at some point broken in two. That's why it suddenly slackened when Sonny was being dragged by the mass of panicking slaves. If their shackles had a less sophisticated locking mechanism, he could have tried to free himself now. However, each pair was fixed to a specific link. Without unlocking them, no one was going anywhere. The tyrant, Mountain King presumably, was hidden from sight by the bright glow of the bonfire. However, Sonny could feel its movements due to the subtle tremor spreading through the stones, as well as the desperate screams of those slaves who were yet to perish. An angry bellow or two could also be heard, indicating that some of the soldiers were still alive, desperately trying to fight the monstrosity off.
What pulled his attention the most, though, was the fact that several of the maimed bodies were starting to move.
More larvae?
His eyes widened. One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each beast looked as disgusting as the first one had, and not a bit less deadly. The nearest was mere meters away from Sonny.
Damn it all. I want to wake up.
A strange clicking filled the air. One of the beasts turned its head toward the 3 slaves and gnashed its fangs. Shifty fell on his ass, whispering a prayer, while Scholar just froze in place. Sonny's eyes darted to the ground, trying to find something to use as a weapon. But there was not a single thing he could use. Full of vitriol, he simply wrapped a length of chain around the knuckles and raised his fists.
Come at me, you bastard.
The larva dashed forward with incredible speed in a flurry of claws, fangs, and terror. Sonny had less than a second to react. However, before he could do anything, a nimble figure moved past him, and a sharp sword flashed in the air. The monster, beheaded with one strike, fell gracelessly onto the ground. Sonny blinked. What was that? Dumbfounded, he slowly turned his head and looked to his left. Standing there with a valorous expression was the handsome young soldier who had once offered him water. He looked calm and collected, if a little grim. There was not a speck of dirt or blood on his leather armor. He is awesome. Poser! He's a poser! With a short nod, the soldier moved forward to face the remaining 3 larvae. But after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave Sonny a long look. Then, with one swift motion, the young warrior took something from his belt and threw it to Sonny. "Save yourself!" With that, he was gone to fight the monsters. Sonny reflexively caught the item and watched the soldier go. Then he lowered his gaze and studied the thing clutched tightly in his hand. It was a short and narrow iron rod with a straight bend on its end. A key. It's a key. It's the key to the shackles.
With one last glance at the fierce battle starting between the young soldier and the larvae, Sonny dropped on one knee and began to maneuver the shackles, trying to get his hand into a suitable position to insert the key. It took him a few tries to understand how the unfamiliar lock worked, but then, finally, there was a satisfying click, and he was suddenly free. The cold wind caressed his bloodied wrists. Sonny rubbed them and smiled with a dark gleam in his eyes. Just you wait now. For a moment, visions of violence and revenge filled his head. "Shifty, over here!" Shifty was waving his hands in the air, trying to get his attention. Sonny briefly considered just leaving him to die, but then decided against it. There was strength in numbers. Plus, despite Shifty's previous threats to kill him and overall unpleasantness, Sonny would have felt bad leaving a fellow slave in chains, especially since freeing him would not cost anything. He hurried over to the other 2 slaves and quickly unlocked their shackles. As soon as Shifty was free, he pushed Sonny away and did a little dance, laughing like a maniac. "Free at last! Gods must be smiling upon us!" Scholar was more reserved. He squeezed Sunny's shoulder in gratitude and smiled weakly, casting a tense look in the direction of the ensuing fight. 2 of the 3 larvae were already dead. The third one was missing an arm, but still trying to tear its opponent apart. The young soldier danced around it, moving with a graceful fluidity of a natural-born warrior. "What are you waiting for? Run!" Shifty made a move to run away, but was stopped by Scholar. "My friend, if you say advise again, I swear to gods I will bash your head open." The 2 slaves looked at each other with open animosity. A moment later, Scholar lowered his eyes and sighed. "If we run away now, we will surely die." "Why?"
The older slave simply pointed at the tall bonfire. "Because without that fire, we will freeze to death before the night is over. Until the sun rises, running away is suicide." Sunny did not say anything, knowing that Scholar was right. Actually, he realized it right after strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was still their only lifeline in this frozen hell. It was just as what the broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had said. There was no need for anyone to kill them, because the mountain itself would do it if given a chance. So what? I prefer freezing to death than being eaten by that monster anyway. Not to mention, turning into one of those things. Shifty was pretending to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform and shivered before taking a small step back. At this point, the 3rd larva was long dead, and the young soldier was nowhere to be seen. He had probably gone to join the fight at the other side of the bonfire, leaving the 3 slaves alone at the mountainside part of the stone platform. The Scholar cleared his throat, trying to reason. The monster might be satiated with those it had already slain. It might be defeated or driven away by the Imperials. In any case, if we stay here, we have a chance to survive, however small. But if we run away, our doom will be certain. So what do we do? Unlike Scholar, Sunny was sure that Mountain King would not be satisfied with killing just most of the slaves. Neither did he believe that a bunch of mortals would really be able to defeat it. Even if they were not normal people but awakened, a fight with a tyrant was not something one could easily survive, let alone win. But if he wanted to live, he had to get rid of that thing somehow. Let's go take a look. Shifty looked at him as though seeing a lunatic. Are you insane? You want to get closer to that beast? Sunny stared at him blankly, then shrugged and headed in the direction of the rampaging monster.
And that brings us to the end of Chapter 5. Sunny's journey into the unknown is just getting started, and honestly, the world of Shadow Slave only gets crazier from here. Now, I need to hear from you. Do you want me to keep this journey going? If you want to hear Chapter 6 and beyond, let me know in the comments below. Drop a comment saying, continue the story, or share your favorite moment from these first 5 chapters. If you enjoyed this audio story, please hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow web novel fans, and let's hype this video up so more people can discover the madness of the nightmare spell. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next drop. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe in the shadows.